I'm very happy to welcome Jeremy Owen Turner, who is a professor in cognitive science at Simon Fraser University. And how long have you been doing research in AI, Jeremy?
In AI, well, I've been making chatbots since probably 2001, but
Yeah.
academically, I would say 2011 or so.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Awesome.
Yeah,
And you also do some industry projects, right?
that's right. I have a startup called WHIRL ASI,
Yeah.
and
Wow.
a little bit about it.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, we really look forward to hearing what you have to tell us. Let me ask you up front, do you want us to just listen and then ask at the end, or can we interrupt, every now and then maybe with some questions?
It's up to you. Just the answer might be on the next slide.
Okay. All
Probably,
right.
not, but I'll let you know if it is or not.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. Well, take it away.
okay, well, welcome, virtual audience. I'm going to talk today about, genius reasoning. Okay, genius may be a bit of an exaggeration, but certainly a creative type of reasoning. We've taught, or your class, I believe, deals with empirical reasoning. Is that the focus of this class? Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So although I am touching a bit on empirical reasoning, this kind of reasoning also involves nativism and rationalism, separate from empiricism. So you don't have to use your senses to get any kind of evidence for this kind of thinking. It's a bit more abstract than that, or it can be. Okay, so we're going to go over a bunch of chaining, how it works for reasoning usually, and we'll talk about some side steps around that. And we'll talk quickly about some, examples, and then we will go further into what we're working on against those examples. So I'll just quickly talk about me, then I'll talk about some what I call practical reasoning, which is usually this linear kind of backwards and forwards chaining. Then we'll talk about how that relates to substantive and transitive thinking in the functionalist paradigm. Then we'll talk about just some examples of how these are usually used, both algorithmically and also architecturally. And then we'll talk about my startup a little bit without leaking too much intellectual property to you. So we'll distract you with a bunch of psychedelic images and talk around it, but we'll do as much as I can to give you the basic idea of that. And then we'll talk more about the quantum computers if you want, and because they're on here, they're mentioned on here. And we're going to talk about what does it mean to be genius, right? What is it versus talent, right? Many people are talented. Kurt Cobain's talented. Kanye West is talented. Are they geniuses? Some people say so. Why? And what does that mean for reasoning and thinking? Are they reasoning and thinking like geniuses? So I mean, some will say no because they're in pop culture, but let's see what that actually means. Some people are very talented, very good reasoners, but some people sort of think in the cliche outside the box. What does it mean to think outside the box? And what does it mean for us when we make things? Okay, so that's what we'll talk about. Just a little bit about me. I've been a cognitive science professor since 2015. I've been trying to make ASIs, well, my whole life, probably deep down in my imagination. Realistically, I started to make ASI scalable stuff, or potentially ASI scalable. That means artificial superintelligence scalable. In say 2011, I really tried. I mean, it's nowhere near AGI or ASI, but I designed them with ASI in mind the whole time, eventually. And I did basic chatbots too, like NPC kind of stuff since 2001 in virtual worlds mainly. So I have a virtual reality background, virtual worlds background as well, metaverse, I guess they call it now. PhD's was in 2018. It's cognitive science, AGI, ASI kind of focus. At the same school, which I also teach at, I did my master's in virtual character design. So I come from a various background. My BA is even in art history and music composition. So I come from different disciplines, and I've been able to synthesize them all into psychology and philosophy as well. And that's where my ideas come from. And I try and translate those into, let's say, engineering principles or something to do with reasoning, for example. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. For my dissertation, I did talk about Kristinn's architecture era a little bit. I can show it to you later if you like. But I've also talked about SOAR and Clarion. This is a few years ago. I've also talked about these architectures in relation to virtual agent minds and personalities, which is sort of my focus, really. And that's basically what I have been doing. Okay. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this practical creative versus creative reasoning and creative reasoning. Doesn't have to be versus, I guess. So I just mentioned that as far as I know, your class is dealing with empirical reasoning based on sensory evidence of some kind. That's fine. There's a lot of empirical reasoning. We can even see empirical belief-based reasoning, such as with Carl Friston's active inference, for example. I don't know if you will study that at all. Yeah, is that the case, Kristinn?
Not in this not in this class,
Oh,
not yet. Anyway,
okay.
we might do it since you mentioned it.
I might do a little bit of that just in case some of the
Sounds good.
terminology is off the rails. Just let me know.
Yeah.
It's not on my slides, but I think I should have talked about it a bit. Anyway, so we're gonna talk about logical chaining. This applies, the creative stuff especially applies to nativist and rationalist approaches. Intuition and gut feeling actually is a form of reasoning. It could be abductive reasoning, for example. So there are different kinds of reasoning. It's not always empirical dependent. All right. But with the more narrow-minded, straightforward, linear, serial kind of logical chaining, whether it's forwards or backwards, it tends to be, well, rationalist and empirical, not so much nativist. However, nativism is optimized for things like, or nativist thinking and nativist reasoning is optimized for things like quantum computers. So that's a great opportunity to explore that side when it's difficult to do that with classical computers. Not impossible, but difficult. You have to do some weird heuristic workarounds. Anyway, let's talk about this in relation to functionalism, where they see everything as a substrate independent form of data and information, some kind of information stream, and our minds or our psyches are information mediators, right? Information processors. So if you think of it as like water, this information stream, if you want, going into the senses, let's say empirically, why not? Because it's an empirical course you have there. Well, your psyche can narrow the information, limit it, close it down. This is good for focusing on tasks, like trying to finish this lecture, trying to do your homework, trying to do those kinds of things, do your spreadsheets and your taxes and everything. Very practical. This is also for strategic thinking of other kinds too. Okay, so we can have this narrow kind of focused kind of reasoning, which is quite common in engineering reasoning and AI-based reasoning. We can talk about forward versus backward chaining. Forward chaining, you start, where you are, and they go, okay, if I want to go that way to do this kind of goal, I have to then do this. So now I did this. Okay, now what? Okay, I'm going to do this, going forward in time until you reach your goal in a very rational kind of way. And yes, you can use empirical evidence for that. Or backwards chaining. You already have a goal in mind, maybe utility, and then you develop some kind of policy from which you can then say, okay, I want to reach that goal way down there. To do that, I'm going to have to then do that before that, that before that, that before that, that before that, etc. But either of these are kind of substantive, closed kinds of thinking. Yes, you can use transitive thinking, this wider, lateral, broadening, opening type of thinking to widen the stream, to let your mind wander. As I tell my COGS 100 class, you usually have your best ideas while washing dishes, your best creative ideas while washing dishes are in the shower, even if that involves reasoning and empirical reasoning. So why is that? Well, you're not so locked into one kind of domain narrowly or one kind of thought stream or anything. It's hard to if your mind conceptually wanders, then you can discover perhaps concepts that you can intermix together to make a brand new kind of idea. Just think about Einstein focusing on classical music as his main analogies to come up with general theory of relativity. Or, I guess Newton had an apple fall and said that's not quite out there, but it's not, he saw it and then he thought about gravity, I guess. So his mind wandered a bit, I'd imagine, and came up with that. So, but there are many artists and many creative thinkers and many so-called geniuses tend to first let their mind wander and then go back to substantive thinking to execute that task, for example, in some rational way. And back and forth, depending on the context. Okay, so forwards and backwards chaining. It's very linear, forwards, backwards, backwards. To go lateral is to go across, right? To go and broaden and open your mind towards other ideas that might not be, you think, related directly to the task, or concepts not directly related to the empirical evidence or whatever. So we can compare, for example, depth first search. versus breadth first search. So depth first search is very substantive. You're just going to keep on going down branches. Up and down, you can do forwards, backwards chaining. Up and down the nodes here, for example. But breadth first, you can go across first and then go down. So you can sort of go a bit wider. Of course, there's a finite limit to this kind of tree to begin with. I mean, this entire search tree might just be limited to a particular kind of domain. So will you just be stuck in this domain, even if it's a bit varied, when you're searching through and reasoning through and chaining all around this? What does that ultimately mean, right? Is there a way to skip from one search tree to another search tree entirely? Kind of teleport over to another search tree and then go across to similar concepts that might seem unrelated? Strange ideas. Yes, there are ways to represent everything into a giant search tree of all domain knowledge. I guess you could do that and then do this kind of algorithmic kind of search, but I could see how that could be very taxing with a brute force kind of way to do so. Okay, there's also cognitive architecture that I know Kristinn knows, but I don't know if you know, is SOAR, state, operator, and result. And that was used for military targeting. So SOAR TAC, Tactical Air Command, for missiles and stuff like that, missile targeting. It's about thinking the world in terms of a target to hit. Okay, so you get some kind of input, you look at the state, let's say it's empirical, why not? And it's figuring out the state it's in, then it proposes some kind of operator or action to do, and maybe another kind of action to select. They select the best one, the SOAR agent, and then they apply it. Then they check out the output and then see if that changed the world enough to receive as new input to do the decision cycle all over again. But it's going in a linear, you can see it's just kind of going around. You could do backwards chaining, look at the world, I guess, and kind of, well, I don't know what that means for output necessarily, but you could sort of go backwards with that. But still a very serial, do this, then this, then this, then this, then this, then this kind of approach. Yes, SOAR is a bit more advanced than that. This cognitive architecture is a bit more advanced, but I talked to John Laird, the founder of SOAR, last week, I think, after meeting him at the conference that Kristinn was at, the AGI conference in Seattle. And I asked him, is there any kind of transitive thinking in SOAR? And he thought about it, and he said, no, actually, I don't think there is. And that maybe is a problem with it. And, of course, I asked him why. He says, well, can't really, he didn't want to design it for parallel processing. That seemed like too much work, right, to do, and maybe consume too many resources. That was his opinion on that. And which may be correct for what he's doing, but so maybe it has to do also with classical computers limiting what you can do, how much you can search across and do things in parallel or instantaneously, simultaneously. Okay, there are some been attempts at more interactive, almost simultaneous, almost parallel kinds of architectures like Clarion over here. They have different subsystems that interact. They can go back and forth. I guess they can go sort of wide. At least they're omnidirectional, backwards, forwards chaining, but maybe there's a bit of side chaining, maybe. So
Can you
yeah.
summarize again
Yes.
exactly the definition of transitive reasoning?
Transitive reasoning is the broadening of reasoning, the going across. So whereas
what are the dimensions?
Oh, it depends.
Across what?
Entire domains.
As opposed to depths?
Yeah, you have to be substantive. You're just focusing on a path. I could be backwards or forwards on that path.
Oh, so yeah, okay.
Like for example, with this SOAR thing, you keep on going. You go to this target down here. You're either going towards this target, forward chaining, or you somehow know what node 3 is here, and then you can figure out you have to do this number 2 first before you can get to number 3.
So substantive reasoning in your terminology is essentially more or exclusively goal-driven.
Yeah, well,
transitive is more like chain of free association.
It can be free association. You could make it a bit sort of goal-driven. You can make it utility-driven, purpose-driven. But it might not be in the engineering way of like, for sure, this is the goal, literally.
So substantive reasoning is substantive reasoning essentially the same as goal-driven reasoning, or I'm just trying to figure
Yeah,
out
if
what's
it's
the
single-minded goal reasoning.
single-minded? Okay.
Like utility, maybe a collection of goals. I mean, the goals to not do anything and drop out, or
What about parallel goals? Like, yeah, exactly. What if you have a system that's explicitly that has several goals that in some cases or some situations may actually conflict, and one of them is, relax and do
yeah,
nothing,
yeah.
right?
I'm not saying it can't happen
So how does
substantively.
that relate to transitive reasoning
Sure.
in your
Sure.
terminology
Well, I
then?
mean, for this substantive reasoning, for example, there is an impasse you can go around, kind of deal, like jump over the obstacle to go around, break it. And you can have sub-goaling in state operator and results, or you can do that kind of thing. But it's still like this focused target, trying to reach a particular target, usually, either going towards the target or backwards from that target. Right? So there's usually a goal in mind, perhaps. Yes, there could be utility that structures goals and sub-goaling as a collection of that meta goal, that mega goal that you're after. Transitive thinking, you might have purpose. If you think utility is purpose for a minute, that can contain goals and sub-goals, which can be deleted or added, or, it's kind of, defining utility versus goal can be a little bit weird. But if you think of it more as a collection of possible goals you can have towards something. So it's still kind of a target, but it's not so much, I got to do this particular thing, as you would see, let's say, in substantive thinking.
But it's the same kind of reasoning though, isn't it? I mean,
yeah,
it's not a different type of reasoning. It's just
different direction
for a different purpose, right?
yes, different direction of reasoning. Like, let's say you're on mine. Let's say my task right now is to give you this lecture.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I could daydream all I want, I guess, but that's probably not going to right now help me with my lecture. I need to focus, whether it's hyper-focus, lock in, right, to a target. The target is to lecture to you.
All right, I think I get it. Yeah.
Rather than, I'm just gonna imagine all sorts of stuff maybe unrelated to the lecture, and now I have a new idea for the lecture, which I didn't think I would ever have.
Yeah.
We'll get more into it when we talk about Schopenhauer targets.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, here's our lab, the startup. So we have a quantum computing guy, Alex Kahn. He wrote the book on Amazon Bracket, and he has access to 2 QPUs that we can use, quantum processing units. They're paid for, so that's gonna be a lot of fun. And there's the business guy, my startup. Okay. These are some of the quantum computers we're going to be using. Actually, they might be used already, or being using up the money already, especially the first one, the Aquila 256 qubit neutral atom gate-based QPU. Okay, there's annealing-based QPUs, which can have more qubits. So you have like this whole cluster or bunch or mess of data that might even be contradictory with tons of potential impasses. And then it will just settle down to an answer. It's really weird. Okay, it's a kind of reasoning, but it's like you could take empirical input and it could be totally contradictory, and then it'll settle. And I did this for a virtual character in Neo's VR, and I used D-Wave's quantum annealing computer. That was 5,000 qubit annealing computer in 2021, 2022. And I'll show you, you can watch a video at home. I have it on the slides too, about all that. But you have many more qubits for that one, because it's just a temperature kind of gradient settling thing. Energy minimization kind of problem. Versus these gate-based ones, which are kind of logic-based kind of ideas. So 2 possible options at the same time, and you can sort of unlock them. One with neutral atoms. I think the rubidium atoms, I'm not totally sure, I forgot. The other ones are trapped ions. And they're both, but the qubit count is lower, just so you can see, lower than 5,000, because they're harder to make. There's also a quantum internet, which they have access to, which I'm trying to get access to, which is through superposition and stuff like that. It's really quantum teleportation, which sounds fancier than it is. But you can have 2 quantum computers talk to each other instantly across time and space. So we're trying to leverage all that for different kinds of engineering challenges, design challenges. Okay, here's just for some context. Here's what I designed. There's a video you can watch on YouTube, or there's 2 YouTubes if you really want. You can watch and see what this does, but I made a quantum oracle that floated around in social VR, at a VR headset. I could walk around, talk to it. And it could scan you using computer vision, and it would stereotype you, and then you would enter in your own preferences. So for example, this is a world recommendation oracle, virtual world recommendation oracle. There are virtual worlds like spheres inside of this psychedelic world, and it will scan you to see what it thinks you will, which world you wish to visit. And then you also plug into this kiosk as to the kind of things you like or dislike to indicate what you actually would like to visit in a world. And then there's this other matrix spreadsheet all figured out, all intermingling as one giant mess of contradictory preferences. For example, I love green and I hate green in a world. What does that even mean? It seems to go against our usual kind of very classical understanding of resolving that kind of impasse. So, because you're talking about the same thing, aren't you? Green. So somehow it still comes to an answer. It might say, oh, you like green. Okay. So that's a longer story. But anyway, this is the pass that we did before I started the startup, 2021, 2022. So you can watch the video as a demo if you want, like me just talking about it and showing people it inside the world. Or you can watch a live broadcast from 2022 of people trying it out, interacting with this NPC that floats around.
Mhm.
Yeah, okay. This is transitive reasoning through the energy minimization idea. It just settles on an answer. Takes in a bunch of empirical data and just says, it just kind of collapses it all to an answer. Okay. Now, the other thing I'm working on now is similar to that. I'm just calling it Will Solver, this current algorithm. But I like the idea of applying philosophy and seeing them as engineering problems, right? I don't know if people are meant to see these as engineering problems, but let's just think, for example, what's the difference between talent versus genius? According to Schopenhauer, again, this is in English, not in his original German. I'm sure it's much better in German. But he said, talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. So can you make an unforeseen target searcher for an agent? Okay, what does it mean to locate previously unforeseeable targets? Right? In SOAR, for example, you can totally lock into a target and be very talented at it, hit it all the time, perhaps with the missiles that they might do for SOAR attack. But what about the kinds of things that no one even thinks to combine? Like, Einstein combined classical music metaphors and structures, and then he came up with, physics ideas like theory of general relativity. So that's also what we mean by going wide. But can you make this in a methodical way? Can you make it in a way that deals with all these impasses and contradictions or apparent contradictions? How do you get around it? How can you sort of cheat and find things that may be off the map of the regular search tree? Okay, one search tree might just have particular domains it covers. Maybe there's a search tree over there in the search space that has its own nodes to figure out. Can't it just leap across, teleport across, and access that? That would be a true lateral kind of thinking, a true quantum kind of thinking. So that's the kind of stuff we're doing. Here's some psychedelic imagery because I can't show you the IP. But the idea, let's see if I can just summarize this. Okay, so the Quera Aquila, that's the first quantum computer we're using right now. It's really good at a particular kind of problem called the maximal independent set problem. And what that means is finding the outliers, finding the most unique nodes that don't seem to be related to any other nodes semantically, let's say. So that can be easy. It can be easy if it's kind of a small space or hard, depends, right? But some of them are almost, I wouldn't say intractable, but they're difficult to brute force search all of that, like traveling salesman problem kind of ideas, and trying to get unique ideas that are totally outliers. So we're to summarize that kind of thing, we list a bunch of cross-domain targets and ideas, concepts, and then we have the gate-based computer, the Aquila. It will find the absolute outliers that aren't related to anything, and then we're going to basically make a concept atom smasher, basically, and smash the outlier ideas together and try and make new concepts that maybe were unforeseen, and see what that means as part of this agent's cognition. that we're working on. Okay, so this combines the idea of Wilhelm Wundt's voluntarism. He believed that your imagination with enough willpower can fuse thoughts, feelings, and pictures into its own independent mind movie, right? You can imagine all sorts of things, but can you imagine a new color? Can you imagine a new concept? Can you imagine a new shape? Can you imagine a new kind of being, like an alien being? I mean, you could probably do that a bit better than a new color, but he thought that through imagination and willpower, you could literally kind of originalize all sorts of otherwise disparate, empirically informed elements. You know, in structuralism, after Wundt and voluntarism, then the empirical world had much more of a corrupting influence on the psyche for your reasoning. Okay, but you know, I think in a way, Wundt's kind of a magical thinker, and also Schopenhauer here. He's not just the guy talking about genius; he's also the guy talking about the world is basically the will, the force. Usually, it's a force kind of against you. That's why he's a pessimist. But you're reasoning against this. It could be not just an empirical force, but also a inside nativist force and a rationalist force. So thinking of it that way, how can we program, let's say, artificial superintelligences to, or give the seeds for them to really figure out what are outsider thoughts beyond our comprehension and fuse them together into stuff that could be of our comprehension. So that's kind of where we're going with this kind of research. This is just a hallucination of other architectures I'm making called onto-architectures. Again, they don't really look like that because I wish they did, but because they're really cool looking. But it's inspiring for me anyway to think outside the regular engineering boxes and modules and arrows like we saw with SOAR and Clarion, trying to, you know, use some cross-domain kind of thinking, psychedelic thinking, to try and get around that and see if it could then go substantive and maybe make some practical uses out of these, perhaps through quantum computing. Okay, but these architectures are personality architectures. So they're layers, kind of higher level layers that can reside over top of any cognitive architecture system, but they're personalized for each character, for each being. So shaping their worldview, we'll use active inference for a minute, their Markov blanket, shaping that, and also you know, using the regular ontologies to understand its ontological commitment to a particular empirical world, for example, and to reason about it based on what it knows, but then maybe change what it knows, shifts what it knows entirely, and then reason about that. Maybe mix them all together into some kind of conception of ontological-based empirical reasoning, for example, that is really alien to us, and yet maybe transcends us, yet includes our reasoning. Anyway, but what we're actually doing is kind of classified there for now. But the idea is to try and make it hyperdimensional. That's probably why quantum computers are useful for us, hyperspatial, ASI scalable, and to do true cross-domain sideways chaining. There's a way you can sort of flatten, kind of like it's almost like the reverse of a support vector machine. You're flattening down all these search trees into one giant search region that you can teleport across. So that's the easiest way I can try and explain it. So we're working on that. Any questions? That was my lecture. I don't know how long that was.
About 30 minutes.
Oh, good.
Yeah, 25 minutes.
That's a relief. Any questions?
Yeah, one question. So you're using, if I understand it correctly, like quantum computers to do transitive reasoning. Sorry, is that correct?
It's involving transitive. It's a kind of transitive reasoning, but the thing is, it's not just what we're doing. Is not just that. It's not just outliers, smashing them together.
Yeah. Also with the solving the maximal independent set problem, right?
That's how we get the outliers. Yeah,
exactly. Don't you have much problems or many problems with errors using quantum computers?
Sometimes they're unstable, right? They're unstable. You know what? We're just doing tests right now on the Aquila, and I haven't seen the results yet. So we just started.
Oh, okay.
Results. But we talked about it, like the quantum programmer and I, we talked about these ideas literally, and he had some ways to test it. and get some data from that as to whether it worked or if it's just some flawed conception we have of these QPUs.
Yeah, because that's at least what I heard from the biggest problem from quantum computers, that yeah, error handling is very difficult.
Yeah, error handling is very difficult, and you know, with their corporate hype, these computers claim that they're handling error correction fine, but yeah, there's errors, but there's, you know, the D-Wave annealer was really good. It's really good. It did things I thought were magical in a way. So and I thought that was very error prone, even though they got these sort of submerged computers, or vacuumed out computers. Yeah, even observation can sort of tamper with it. So
Could you summarize for us what quantum computing brings to reasoning that, you know, that moves it into or makes possible some new results or new approaches?
sure. Yeah, good question. So we can normally do our empirical reasoning through our own Markov blanket, our own kind of worldview at the resolution we understand everything. And then we could, you know, empirically just figure things out as we go, like cause some actions, change the environment, see what happened, and reason about that, either forward or backward. For example, yes, you can do transitive thinking for that. Humans do that. But sometimes we go on our gut feeling or a leap of faith to go from one domain area to a completely different one we thought was unrelated, completely unrelated. Like if let's say you want to think of a new math equation or something, and the first thing that comes to your mind is green math. What does that even mean? Sounds like it's completely unrelated. But maybe you'll come to a point where something about greenness, something about this green search tree over here, anything to do with the concept green will somehow inform a new math idea or equation. So there's nativism there. It's not strictly empirical. It doesn't have to be empirical. It could be totally rational by itself. So, yeah,
Axiomatic, you mean?
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so you're just talking about that. To me, that sounds like you're talking about inspiration. Of course, inspiration can come from anywhere.
But inspiration can be a form of reasoning.
Are you saying that you have a different approach to inspiration somehow, or is that somehow related to quantum computing? Or
Kind of, yeah. I mean, trying to reverse engineer, you know, people in AI or AGI, ASI, et cetera, are trying to reverse engineer things quite often, right? Reverse engineer cognition, how we think, psychology, how we've grown to think about things, but also in terms of what, you know, creativity. Schmidt-Huber tries to unlock that, reverse engineer that, for example, right? It's supposed to be something that's supposed to be too qualitative to untangle from an engineering perspective, but he has a way that reverse engineers creativity, or at least explains it. Why can't you do that for everything else? What's inspiration then? Right? It could also be an information compression situation, like Schmidt-Huber does it, but there are other ways to think about too. What the quantum does is it truly is transitive in the sense it goes completely outside them back in. It entangles things that maybe weren't meant to be entangled, and then it can link, especially the quantum internet that's coming out.
I don't understand what any of that means.
Oh yeah. So
can you unpack that for us, please?
the quantum internet. Yeah.
No, everything you said.
Everything I said. Everything I said.
Yeah, in the last 30.
Sometimes when you reason through things, right? Let's say for an empirical world, like, oh, this happened, so I guess I'll do this next. You know, that kind of empirical reasoning.
Yeah.
Forward chaining. Let's just use forward chaining for a minute. And you keep on going around, looking at the world, taking in the data, observing it, processing it, and then figuring out what to do next.
Yeah.
What's the next rational choice given the evidence, like a Bayes rule thing or whatever. You know, that's how we tend to operate. We tend to disregard, I say tend to, because not everyone disregards this. Artists tend to stereotypically regard other ways of thinking that might not be normally seen as engineering type principles, like to do with nativism, faith.
Yeah.
But can that be reverse engineered? That's sort of the research question.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if so, how? And if so, with what means? Because brute forcing everything would be weird for that kind of association to do. I'm not saying it doesn't happen implicitly or something, to brute force your transitive thinking and somehow you got some new insight, or inspiration. But I think a quantum computer allows for a lot more parallel, outside the box kind of thinking, and comes up with solutions you thought were contradictory even, and solves it in its own interpretation. I don't know if that answers anything.
Yeah, so basically I took a quantum computing course, and at least what I heard is that quantum computers can be beneficial, especially for cryptography, for example.
Right. Yeah.
But not for everything.
Not for everything, no.
Classical computers are as good as quantum computers can be.
Yeah.
And some problems. But in your startup, you like deployed algorithms that provably can speed up those.
It's okay. So it's not entirely quantum what we're doing. It's
Okay.
quantum classical. I'm talking about the quantum part of it, which is to sift out the true outliers of concepts. That's all we're using it for that instance.
Outliers of what?
Different concepts. For example, might take concepts of structures of classical music and take concepts that have known physics. I mean, Einstein did that already, and make them own like search trees based on that, concept search trees, and then see if they can mix things that are completely weird, like green math, for example. Okay, that's not symphonic mixed with physics, but I just mean those kinds of strange.
Okay, so it's really a quantum imagination that you're after. Is that
quantum reasoning too? Yeah.
Well, imagination has the property that it can follow any rules. It can also be illogical, but
yeah,
it can pick, so reasoning sort of can always encompass that situation by saying, well, I reason that if I let my mind flow around contradictions and things that are illogical, this will give me something. Right?
Yeah, there's consistent
so
logic.
ultimately, when you're doing AI, this is at least what I teach my students, there is always a purpose for your research or R&D, no matter what state the work is in. And it might be that to relax you as an employee or as an owner of a company, to relax you this evening. And you could, it's up to you whether you classify that as basically part of your work or not. But a lot of interviews with high-paid CEOs say that golf is essential to their job, and so that's how they can write it off as a business expense. In any case, I digress. In any case, I don't think these are so. Yeah. When people use the term reasoning, they often use it in a very, very narrow sense, as in axiomatic reasoning. But reasoning in situations and with information that is incomplete, that's when you get into empirical reasoning. And that is essentially any practical reasoning that you could possibly imagine will have accept that there's missing information, right? So that means that you're not, you're already outside of axiomatic reasoning when you talk about empirical reasoning. And this in this sense, imagination has to be to some extent logical, as in empirically logical, for it to make any sense whatsoever to the reasoner. Right? I mean, if you disagree with that, I'd love to hear what your thoughts on it.
There are some things. No, I'm not trying to say that we're hypercomputers. I'm not going to go there. But first of all, there's abductive reasoning, right? Abductive logic, kind of sort of guessing, right? That's not the most. That could be based on no real empirical information. It's like, yeah, I think this is kind of true, whatever that is. You can sort of do that. That's a
Well,
very,
that depends on the kind of system that's doing the
Yes.
reasoning and
Yeah.
the basic purpose for why you're doing the reasoning.
Yeah.
That's why I say, ultimately, if you're talking about an AI, it was made for a purpose.
right.
Whether it's to, entertain you in the evenings when you're off work, or whether it's to figure out some problems when you're doing your job. So it's always, there's always a purpose. And even if the purpose was, I just made it for fun. So you see,
Yeah.
so that's my point.
Oh.
When you ask nature, like, what's the purpose of living beings and what's the purpose of humans? Nature does not answer that.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
that situation is different. The natural general intelligence that the only general intelligence we seem to agree on, to call that, is humans. And there's no real answer to the question, why? Why did humans come into existence? Let me put it that way. But for any artificial thing that humans make, there is a purpose for it, unless you point to this human that made that thing and say, that's a zombie with no sense of its own place in the universe. So that's essentially, so I always come back to that, and therefore, so that's a very high level, very abstract, right? So if we try to narrow it down and talk about talk about it more concretely, the question is essentially, if you're making an AI and you want it to be useful for something, well, then it must be empirical to some extent. It must be connected to the world. Even if the designer, the human that created it, is the only connection to the world, then there has to be that connection. Otherwise, how are you going to measure whether it's useful or not?
To us, yeah. I mean, there's also the problem of over designing for human instrumentality, like the paperclip maximizer. You just make an AGI making the best paper clips, you've totally narrowed what it could do, even if that was your purpose for building it.
Yeah, exactly.
ASI can be a wider thing, much wider than even we realize.
Yeah.
And so how do you design for that? How do you design for an ASI that might totally abandon you and go beyond you and you don't even know what the hell's going on?
Well, that's
But
a very different
anyway.
question. But I think the artificial imagination is a valid pursuit, absolutely. And you could say that the dimension of creativity, if we agree on sort of roughly what creativity kind of means, and if we can agree on a decently large set of examples of creativity, then, which I do think we can, then essentially creativity has to do with basically exploring laterally, as you're saying. But but to me, that is a natural part of any natural intelligence or any useful general intelligence.
Useful to us or useful to
any purpose that you could assign to. So we know already what the purpose of our intelligence is to essentially, if there is a purpose, the only purpose is to basically sustain a presence on the planet. That's it. Because if it wasn't like that, if that wasn't an implicit, or sometimes explicit goal of individuals in a species, then that species would not exist.
Right.
So the infinitely large set of species that don't exist, none of them had a goal to survive, right?
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So, but so anyway, if you think of energy and time as being limited resources, and implemented computation to be costly in that sense, then surely any being whose future is uncertain would want to spend some of that cost, if they have a budget, would want to spend some budget on time and energy, thinking about the future so that it can stick around. And, you know, whatever else, whatever other purpose it would have, right? So there is always a purpose, whether it's explicitly or implicitly built into the system, the study, right? And as academics, of course, we study systems that can be done for, you know, that third parties like us can basically point to and say, well, it's sort of, you could say, even though it's nowhere written anywhere that in nature that humans' ultimate goal is to sustain, you know, their existence. You can basically proceed as if that is a goal, because really, without that, they wouldn't exist. So you know, right?
I'm not saying that there's no teleological direction in transitive thinking. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's more about purpose than about particular goals, particular targets that are seen. When you go outside that, it's, for example, Einstein. Let's just use Einstein as an example. When he does his transitive thinking, he has a goal or purpose. His purpose is to be a scientist that makes breakthroughs. That's his purpose.
Exactly.
Now, what are the targets to match that purpose is maybe a bit more open-ended. He's got to search for them in a weird space to retrieve that information. Doesn't have to be empirical necessarily, although some philosophers argue that everything is empirical ultimately that we get, but that depends then if that's really what goes on or not. I mean, some philosophers think the objective world is unknowable anyway, right? So what is that? So,
well, it is unknowable. I mean, ultimately, we don't know everything there is to know about, unless you think we've already figured everything out. There's still more to know, right? So there's some stuff we don't know. The argument whether that goes on forever is essentially an unanswerable one, because even if we had the answer to everything, we wouldn't know it for sure. So we couldn't be sure, right?
Yeah. The other thing
Who's to tell us it's going to be someone outside of the universe, someone in a different dimension, you know, and by definition, that dimension is inaccessible to us. But I think these are too high level. I would like to get back to some extent. All of this has to do with definitions of terms, right? Because I hear you saying, you know, you're not necessarily disagreeing with me that lateral thinking or you know, transitive reasoning has a purpose, but to me that indicates, or has a goal, to me that indicates that we may have slightly different definitions of goals and purposes, as well as reasoning, in fact. So there's an important point here that I think maybe would be worth spending a couple of minutes try to clarify.
Well, for you, what is the difference between a utility and a goal?
So I have an easy time basically saying there's a top level goal. I don't care what you call it, but it's a top level goal. And there are two types, the two forms that this comes in. These are sort of cartoon, you know, there's a spectrum, of course, like with everything, but two types you could say. One is implicit. That has to do with that the purpose of this phenomenon, this system, this process, etc., is hardwired or is wired, is inherent in the way that the system is put together. And the other one is that there's a place in the system where it's kind of written in a very nice, compressed, abstract form, what the purpose of this thing is. So, for instance, let's take a vacuum cleaner. This is sold with the explicit purpose of cleaning rooms. Now, you can say, well, I opened the wiring of a Roomba and I don't see this goal anywhere. It's been hardwired into the thing. It's like completely wired from the bottom up to the top down. You know, its purpose is to clean rooms, and if you want to try to use it to cut your lawn, you know, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to get anywhere, right?
Right.
So that's an implicit kind of goal. It is a drive or a purpose is a kind of a goal. It's in that category. These terms have definitions separate definitions that can be useful, but I find them to vary quite a bit between researchers. So I
Yeah.
always start with, going down the list of clarifying this. Reasoning, of course, when people throw this term around, they normally mean axiomatic reasoning, where all the rules are known and it's a finite list of rules.
Yeah, but there's also abductive reasoning. It's a form of reasoning. It's not the most practical.
You can do abductive reasoning in closed worlds where all the rules are known. But yes,
You can do that, yeah. But
in the case, because it's talking about history that you may not be aware of, for instance, it's true, it may have unknown states, but so is deduction if you're trying to deduce sort of going forward in a chess game. If I do this move, then they made this move.
I mean, like when I think of abductive reasoning, I think of an example where I might say, not that I do say this, but I might say, you know what, green math is possible in some possible world, I guess. Sure, why not? Without any empirical verification, without any, and it might be true.
Yeah.
Multiverse.
Yeah, let me
semantics.
Okay, let me segue to another thing then, because I think what is very important in talking about, to me, actually, forgive me if you don't choose not to use the term creativity, but I would say, the use of imagination in solving, to various extents, in solving problems. Let's just take an engineer trying to design a bridge under constraints that are fairly unusual, so they can't go to the handbooks and say, look, how do you build a bridge, right? Mm-hmm. The use of imagination there is essentially, let's say, increased emphasis on creativity in the process of designing this bridge. You still have a high top level goal, ultimately. And ultimately the purpose of this effort or this mental operation, which is, there's no bridge, day one, day X, there's a bridge, there's a solution to that situation, right? You still, you will have varying levels of reliance on, let's say, transitive reasoning, but it will ultimately serve a certain goal and you can measure it ultimately. But I would say, this happens all the time. It's just at different levels in humans. It's at different levels of different amounts. And it all comes down to this, in my opinion. How do you decide as a thinker what is relevant? What are relevant methods? What are relevant types of reasoning? What is relevant information? And to some extent, what inspires you, if that's especially called for, right? Is there something in that you don't like or disagree with? I won't be offended. I'm just curious.
No, I mean, but like, for example, that green math in a possible world. I mean, it could be true. It could be true. I don't know if it's true. I have no empirical verification of it. Could be true.
Yeah, but the ultimate test for whether that was a waste of time or not is whether it helped you get your solution.
Yeah.
Right?
So maybe, well, I'm thinking about that. Solution. Yeah. Yeah, I guess. I feel still that it's trying to anchor it to this world too much.
There is no way in which you can anchor anything to anything else than this world, ultimately.
If you mean like, yeah, I mean, you could say I empirically read some modal logic books about possible worlds, and then I empirically read from a book about other stuff, and then my imagination now goes, oh, there's possible worlds. So
I think the problem with this, there are worlds that are detached from this one, and you could also make AIs that operate in those worlds, and that would be worth something, or that would be great, or that would be fun, or whatever. But I can point to the wall in this room and say, well, there's an arrangement of atoms in that wall that essentially computes something amazing. It's an imaginary world, and it has no bearing on this world. You know, what's the point of that? It's a mental exercise, sort of like saying, well, ultimately we'll know the you know, formula for everything. You know, even if you had it, you wouldn't be able to know that you had it.
Well, here's the part of it. If you're talking just pure empiricism, there's a Markov blanket issue, which is you look at the wall, you can't see the atoms. You don't know they're there. You've been told they're there. Scientists have verified things. You look at the data saying it's there, they exist.
Yeah.
It's not pure empirical experience. It's not like, oh, there are the atoms. I see them form the wall.
Yeah, ultimately, to me, that's a fun exercise, like the multiple worlds interpretation. What's the point?
Well, the point is that maybe empirical information is only partial information to reason from. There are other types.
That is correct.
Yeah. And scientific, you know, as you know, the scientific method is the rational empirical combo. Tend to disregard the nativist, the gut feeling, the faith, the intuition.
Well, I think that's, yeah, I think there's a mistake there, in that there's a fundamental push throughout history of science to essentially, whenever someone comes up with a new angle or way to think about, let's say, just for argument's sake, the scientific enterprise, for instance, there are those that try to push that to its extreme. And what that, you know, and partly that is just to be heard, because when you have extreme views, people pay attention. That's how it works. And so you get more attention if you go to the extremes. And this is almost always a mistake, because it comes to essentially fundamentally incorrect ideas, like let's say John McCarthy, who basically believed to his deathbed that you could do a general intelligence via axiomatic reasoning. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. In fact, all the evidence points to exactly the contrary. Why did he stick to his guns? Well, because there's a framework, a theoretical framework of axiomatic math that he feels very comfortable with, and a lot of other people, in fact. So, you know, if you push things to this extreme, you know, like saying nativist, or the idea of a perfect circle, you know, because there is no perfect circle in reality, then I could just as well argue that basically math is completely irrelevant to intelligence, because there is no such thing as a perfectly round perfect circle and or infinitesimally small point. And so those are all irrelevant. Well, that would be exactly the same mistake in the other direction. We have evidence for people coming up with ideas that cannot possibly exist. And are they useful? Yes. Why do they stick around? You know, like Schopenhauer's point about the genius comes up with ideas that no one else, or points out solutions that no one else could see. But what is not mentioned there is that only those ideas, or only those ideas that no one else can see, that actually have some value. You know, there is survive essentially. You know, for each genius, there's a bunch of lunatics. Why? What's the difference? They all have like wild ideas that no one else can see. So what's the difference? It's empirical. The difference is empirical. That's it.
Yeah, or it's a consensus based on empirical. Yeah.
Yeah, it's always empirical. It doesn't matter. You know, you have a whole country, you know, it seems half a country that's supposedly going to vote for Trump. You can see, you know, they're all wrong. It doesn't matter the numbers. They're all wrong because they are ignorant of history.
Right. But some people, like, how do they come up with time crystals being real? How do they come up with, they empirically exist apparently, but.
Well, yeah, great example is the, you know, string theory. It's the theory that grew out of methodology that grew out of tools.
Mhm,
It's like the carpenter saying, you know, I have a tool. I'm going to open this tool chest and I'm going to come up with hypothetical buildings that can be built with these tools. And then, you know, people work day and night to try to build them, and they don't. They always fall down. It's
mhm.
like, yeah, you can't inspire theories from your tools. Your toolkit is there to help you figure out how the world works. It's not the other way around. And so I think there's a lot of evidence for this kind of carrying fundamental abstracted ideas forward as the ground truth being a very bad idea. And I absolutely don't think that Einstein did that, in fact, even though this is all inspired from his work.
Mhm.
So, but that's just an opinion, that's an opinion that has formed, that I've formed over the years by studying the philosophy of science and
Mhm.
teaching that for 2
Right,
decades.
yeah, it's the rationalist empiricist framework.
Well,
That
it's my point basically being that that you can, if you push this into either extreme, you lose sight of reality, and ultimately everything boils down to reality.
of this reality.
This experience that, you know, science is based on a consensus of evidence, essentially, and a coherence network of statements. And if there are contradictions, we can agree that there are contradictions and so on. And this is by far the most reliable and longest sustained single method of creating reliable knowledge that humanity has ever invented. So if you have ideas, if someone has ideas for other ways of doing it, I'm all ears. But
It's
it would always
almost,
be compared to that.
I'm just pushing back for being devil's advocate just because
Okay.
it's fun.
Yeah.
But you could
By
almost
all
think
means.
you think empiricism is useful to you because you're in the framework of empiricism. So it's a circular kind of reasoning. You're like, oh, I love evidence. Here's the evidence. It's proving it. Therefore, it works. It's the evidence is supporting it. Is my belief in evidence.
So you're saying belief in evidence.
It's like a Markov blank. It's like a way you see the world, perceive the world, right?
Yeah, with that argument, you could say, you know, you have no grounds of committing people to mental institutions.
Yeah. I mean, you could take psychedelics and the reality's not the same.
Is that what you're saying?
In a sense, like the perception changes the reality. Yes, you could say objective reality still exists and you can still push that person over when they're drugged up and high, but
Oh, we have a definition of objectivism here.
yeah.
That has been argued over and scrutinized for now about 2 centuries, at least, unless you go all the way back to the Greek philosophers, in which it's quite a bit more. But the reason that we systematize science is because the methods work. Now, are they
It works
perfect? No,
within the
not at
framework that
all.
confirms this reality, this empirical reality.
But,
Yeah.
you know, I can believe that I can walk through a door and I can bump into that door, forever, like the rest of the day. I'm not going to go through that door. And that's a kind of mixed, that's a good example actually of the mixture of nativism and
Yeah,
empiricism.
nativism. Yeah, I was about to bring that up.
Because I just take that idea and I say, well, for this period of time, maybe sometime in the future, I'll invent someone will invent technology that allows me to walk through doors without opening them. But for now, what works is the empirical evidence that has always worked since I was born, that if I grab the handle and pull the door, it will open, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, you can say it's a belief system, but it works. This is the fundamental difference. Empirical information is useful because it works.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's not useful, but it's not necessarily doesn't mean everything always works. So you can't rely on just empiricism. You can rely on rationalism and also the nativism, like you predict that the physics is going to remain the same objectively. right? Like it,
My point is, you're missing my point. My point is basically that if you go to any extreme on these dimensions,
yes,
you will miss out.
I
Essentially,
agree with
you
you. I
stop
agree.
being a scientist and become a philosopher. And sure, there's also utility in that,
Yeah,
but it doesn't have the same measurement of success. You know, the
yeah.
measurement of success for a scientist is that they produce a new explanation for something that there were only partial or faulty explanations for before, right?
Mhm,
Yeah, the measurement for a philosopher is that they get people to look at things in a different way and make some progress on thinking about things.
mhm.
Yeah,
But
that's the difference
yeah,
between a
yeah,
philosopher and a scientist.
yeah. But however, some people can still make pretty good pseudo-empirical inferences based on, let's say, they're on psychedelics or something like that, and they can actually have empirical evidence that's warped still be confirmed.
That's all I'm saying. That's all
Yeah.
I'm saying. These
Oh,
are
okay.
not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I agree with you.
You
Yeah.
should not try to
100%.
exclude one or the other, I
Yeah.
think. And
Oh, yeah.
so drawing these lines with
Oh, yeah.
isms between these
Yeah, yeah.
is kind of a silly exercise and
I know what you're saying. Okay.
against the, it works against science
Well,
essentially.
I should just clarify that I'm not just talking about you go transitive forever. It's transitive substantive. When you need to be grounded in this reality, get stuff done, right? Then you go wide, because if you just do that, then that will only serve you so much, and then you sometimes have to go wide to go back in.
Yeah.
Oscillate
Yeah,
back and forth.
I see that.
Yeah.
I see. And,
Yeah, I'm not saying sideways chaining only or transitive thinking only. It's just
yeah,
one thing I'm exploring, that side of it. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So in my mind, it's more useful to think. So I think let me ask you this, one question here. I know it's getting late on your side.
Mhm.
One question here is, what do you think about, can some of these, let's say, can your way of thinking about these things and your work be in part or maybe more or less be described as the question of what information is relevant at what time?
Yeah. Well, I would say that's
Okay.
much that I mean, I can think of exceptions to that, but
Yeah.
yeah, if you just want to just for now, for tonight, yeah, I wouldn't
Let's say
disagree.
that let's say you have a system that can do depth first, breadth first,
Sure.
both of them, either of
Yeah.
them, or
Yeah.
even parallelized, right?
Yeah.
And let's say that system also, can do sort of single-minded, goal-directed kind of
Yeah.
reasoning,
Oh, yeah.
also sideways.
Yes.
Then go to the next level up and say, okay, well, you've got now four classes of ways of doing things, and you've got a fifth one, which is which ones do you want to parallelize, right?
Yeah.
Could you say that then a question for that system at any point in time doing anything really is to how to use its CPU, its time and energy, basically for those things, right? Because it's not going to do that for everything at all the time. It's
Yeah.
gonna have to pick and choose, right?
Yeah. The optimization issue is, I mean, the quantum optimization for the QPUs is a bit different, but but for classical CPU, that has to go through all the search spaces.
But the quantum computer still has limitations.
They all have
So,
limitations. Oh, yeah.
right. So, it's got the qubits. So the count of the qubits, you're going to have to say what those qubits represent, right?
Yes.
And so on. So
Yes.
if imagine, if I'm trying to design this bridge again, I know it's a bit, mundane example, but then I need to decide, what are the dimensions relevant to this bridge or what are the reasoning methods, or what are the search operators that are relevant for designing this bridge? I'm going to use those qubits for that, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm
Yeah.
not going to, use them for how to take vacation next summer.
Right.
It's not relevant for the bridge, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's why we're not just making our own algorithms. We're also trying to use the quantum computers maybe to enhance things like SOAR, not just ditch them, but
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting.
enhance them. And same with ERA. So I want to talk to you about ERA, of course, later.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
no, I love SOAR. It was one of my favorite ones. It sounds like I'm trashing it. I'm not. I just trying to find other avenues to pursue, right?
Oh, it's been around for so long. It's easy to
Yeah.
trash it.
No, it's a
Wait,
classic. It's a classic, but in that really, but I talked to him about it's open source, so I'm going to take it and find ways to see if it can do this other kind of reasoning with a quantum computer, perhaps.
Oh, I would love to have you do sort of a devil's advocate in comparing ERA and SOAR. That would be so awesome.
Happy to do that. Happy to do that. I do teach about ERA and SOAR in my COGS 100 class. I talk about constructionism and constructivism too. Your paper. I talk about those pros and cons of either and
Really
how
great.
it could be a hybrid
Yeah,
or
it's
whatever.
fantastic. Nice to hear.
Yeah, love it. Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't want to keep you any longer. This has been a fantastic session, I have to say, beyond my wildest expectations. And thank you for indulging me in a bit of a deep dive into some terminology and other things. It's really, I mean, this is kind of this is what moves science forward. I think learning from each other and thinking about these things.
Yeah, and empirically, I'm rich, living on a penthouse suite as far as you know, because your empirical evidence is confirming that.
That's right.
And if I stare enough into the screen, I'm also in that world too. But
yeah, that's right. You are in Reykyavik.
There we go. That's a special thanks too. I just threw that slide up there just to give some props here. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's been fantastic. I'll send you a link to the recording.
Yeah, and let me know when you can meet for the ERA stuff.